I want to teach you about kits for Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd Edition. Before I get into the details, we'll focus on what the kits were for. They were mainly for role-playing the character from the start of the game, because Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd Edition focused on the identity of the character before you even got to the dungeon. Why is that? Let's go back into the history of Dungeons and Dragons. I want you to think of early D&D and TSR as a long experiment with a group of people trying to figure out what the game was about. Imagine you made a game initially for what they call war gamers. Well, you made a game to attract them. It wasn't a war game, but it had elements of wargaming in it to attract those people. But you made some elements just in case the wargaming elements didn't exactly work and there were other people. You realized you had other non-wargaming people working on the game, so you make combat aimed towards wargamers, but you make an abstract version of combat that was safe, that could be for anybody. And there was another reason. The things that you would use for combat were called miniatures, and they were quite expensive. If you weren't exactly a wargamer, or if you were someone just outside of that hobby, you might think it's too costly to buy miniatures. You might not want to buy miniatures for the game. So they have a version of combat that you can do through the imagination. And it's the default gameplay. And they have an optional way of doing combat through miniature gameplay. Optional because, well, you need the pieces. And if you don't have them, what do? You go to the default. See, what they call pure theater of the mind combat wasn't optional. It was default. It was mandatory. Mandatory meaning it could be replaced with the optional miniature, combat. But if you don't have miniatures, well, there's no third way to do combat. There's only two ways. Either you do pure theater of the mind, or you use miniatures. That's what's going to happen in combat. And strangely, combat is an important focus of the game, but not in the way that you think. It's going to be a little confusing here. Nothing is as direct as you think it is. There's a lot of nuance in everything, right? If you understood wargamers, strategy and all that towards combat was more important than fighting itself, even in a war game. And this was true in Dungeons and Dragons. Combat was going to happen. It's something you can't avoid in the game, nor do you want to really outright avoid it. But when it came to wargamers, it was always never be careless about going into combat. Strategy and all that was always going to be the main focus. You do that, like your position at the start of a war game could be the reason you win. Not because fighting, just by standing where you put your characters down, you've already won. So strategy, approach was always more important. You don't rush into combat. Rushing in can get you killed. That would be no good. In Dungeons and Dragons, it's the same thing. The early levels from 1 to 3 was about survival. Right? You need to survive till you get to the point where on the strategic level, you're more capable of fighting. But you're a farmer from the get-go. So it's assumed you're really untrained purely, like as far as being out there in the field and actually doing this. So survive until you have better gear. Survive until you're in a position to actually be more confident about fighting. And that means avoid almost all combat as much as you can. Or if you go into combat, make it work in your favor. Kill the leader that you see where there's an obvious leader to break the line. Make your enemies run away. Those moral checks. Have the fighter stand in the doorway so he can't be surrounded. And the monsters can't simply get to the wizard or the thief. Always make sure combat is in your favor. Never just run up and fight in some casual way. And when you can, most of the time, avoid combat. That's why when you would read about combat encounters, it didn't suggest players should go into the fighting this way or that way. Most of the suggestions were how to negotiate, how to avoid combat. So they looked at combat like resource draining. So early levels from 1 to 3, combat was more like a punishment than something you should be doing. Now to a patient wargamer, that's good gameplay. Here's the issue with D&D. It wasn't going to really draw wargamers. It was made for them, and then, for the most part, rejected by them completely. Not that TSR or Gary Gygax knew that was going to happen. By the time Gary starts letting other people do a lot of work on the game, going into BECME, that you could tell they realized the vast majority of our people are not wargamers. And that meant the wargaming aspects were not as appealing to these people. But you don't want to lean too far away from it, because there is some wargamers. There's an element that the nerds making the game at TSR want to keep some elements in. This is less a business move and more of a personal nerd move, which is the way it comes across to me. It's nerds having a hard time becoming business people, bending into what it's calling for in the market, what's obvious. They want to win some debate, but they're going to lose in the long run. So, what do they start noticing? Well, first off, they do write the game more for non-wargamers, but trying to bend non-wargamers into still a mindset of wargaming. But they definitely went away from the rules that were more specific. Miniatures were still optional, and they were going to remain optional right until the end of TSR. Pure theater of the mind combat, pure theater of the mind, every area of the game was going to be mandatory. There's no third way to play. There's either with miniatures or without. And if miniatures are optional, well, then the mandatory gameplay becomes without. That's pure theater of the mind. That's it. That's the without miniatures. So you can't get around that. That's going to be mandatory if you don't use the optional miniature option. Again, most people don't have miniatures. One of the things they started doing around original D&D and BECME was suggesting people use little chip pieces and that, and some people did, not many. Most people were doing pure theater of the mind. But you have a group of nerds that still don't want to bend to that reality, right? They just don't want to bend to it. Where you would need miniatures, like, larger combat is for miniatures. Most people just avoided using miniatures and doing the larger scale combat. They would do combat that played to the pure theater of the mind. That was happening at tables more than TSR wanted to admit. So still being nerds and less business people, they keep trying to hold on to these aspects going forward into Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition. So Advanced Dungeons and Dragons First Edition sells like hotcakes because the potential of what it is appealing, even to people that aren't going to initially like it once they get into it, but it's appealing, very appealing. And there's something broken that happens with AD&D 1. Most of the people that get it start trying to play it in ways it's not meant for. So even though the game would drill at you, it's about survival. Most people are playing it for action, even from level 1 on. What would happen? You would see weird things, like the common practice, make multiple characters. Well, if the game is not broken, you shouldn't have to make 5 characters. So what people didn't realize about this practice was it was a sign that they were playing a game in a broken way. It wasn't the game was broken initially. They were playing it in a way that didn't align with what the game is the designers want. You're going for action right away. The game is made to repel that. So what do you do if you just keep going after something, even though the game keeps telling you, calm the fuck down, dude? But you're not calming down. It keeps telling you, action is not the aim early on. You can get at it later. Be patient. You're like, no, fuck you. I'm not being patient. That's why a lot of DMs, including Gary, would start with experienced players would start the game at level 3. Because even he realizes at his own table, more people are going for action. That's the thing. They're trying to play the game in a way it's not meant to exactly be played right away. And that early on survival teaching is going to be good for the long run of the game. But if you have experienced players that went through it, I guess you can bypass the teaching phase of the game, right? They should know to be more strategic and be careful, but that first part of the game is to teach you that, right? But you have people just playing it in this weird way. Here's another issue that's happening. Because they don't play it exactly how the game is designed to be played, the games keep breaking down. So most campaigns for AD&D 1 are flopping. I mean, the vast majority, like 90%, don't make it into months, don't make it into a year. year plus. There's some great stories out there of AD&D 1E campaigns going into 1 year, 2 years. True, with a minority of people. Or campaigns lasting months. True, with a minority of people. So it happened, right? And some people at home had that experience. But if you were out and about and you were in a gaming community like what I was, you would watch, the vast majority not get even like 3 weeks into campaigns. Bust, 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 bust. It drove a lot of people away that initially bought the game because they're looking to play a game that's not there. Like, they like the idea, they like the concepts of what D&D is, but D&D is trying to give them a game they don't really want. They want the ideas with action. They want the ideas with a different approach. But there's another area, not just action, that D&D was missing out on. Something I personally noticed, I talked about it recently, I've talked about it many times in the past, was on top of the action, there's something non-wargamers liked. Developing the personality of their character. And it was so vital to them that by the time they would develop a personality in AD&D 1E, it could take you over a year, because you're not aimed towards it. So it would just take time for it to happen. So if you were in long enough that a character lasted long enough for you to build up a personality, you would bypass certain issues. So here were certain issues AD&D 1E and Beckme had, which was inconsistent players showing up to campaigns. So the long campaigns went through multiple players because there was inconsistency with players showing up and continuously showing up. Same thing with the games that lasted for months or the games that lasted for weeks. That means most of the time who you start with isn't showing up consistently. Ever. But something broke that mold. Finally, DMs would get to a point after a long time of going, oh wow, finally my players are showing up every week. Properly. They didn't do it in the first few weeks. They didn't do it in the first few months. Hell, they didn't even do it in that full first year. But the second they have personalities to their characters, it's no longer Brian the fighter or Brian the cleric. Now Brian has a character with a separate name and a separate personality from himself. Wow, Brian's showing up every single week now. But before this, there was no consistency. Brian wasn't showing up every week for the games that lasted for months. Brian wasn't showing up for the games that lasted for weeks consistently. Suddenly, they had consistency. So there's two areas that TSR, through this experimenting, through the game testing, is learning in their early lifespan. Is most players are not wargamers. Most players like action out of the gate. Most players like to develop character personalities. It was just like the game nerds at TSR are trying to force their way onto the greater, player base. And the player base is simply outright rejecting all this nerdy forcing. And I think it held TSR back because TSR was packed with nerds that wanted to be right instead of wanting to be people that were business people. That's an issue, right? You have to adjust to what you're seeing. They didn't want to. They want to win a war with the players. They weren't going to win it. The players weren't going to adjust to what they wanted. They simply didn't have those type of mindsets, and you weren't going to force it into them. This is who they were and what they wanted. Now, second edition finally acknowledges a lot of this. It makes early level more survivable. Oh, still tight like old D&D. They're still holding on, but there's more survivability drilled into the game. Drilled into it, right? So, basically there was optional stuff in AD&D 1E, but by second edition, they were like, okay, people want potential action from the get-go. You could play it like it was a surviving focus game, so that they didn't take it away completely, but they made it easier to survive the early levels if the DM wanted to use certain options. It was just easier. It was easier to turn it into a somewhat action-focused game. Somewhat. Still be careful. But more action for the players because, well, they're playing that way. You can't get around it. The other thing is the personality gimmick. They really didn't focus on the identity of who the character was, developing the character's personality. Second edition says right out of the gate, you're not going to wait over a year for it to just happen because we didn't care about this before. Now we're going to focus on it, and through the focus, you could get it done not 1 week, but 2 weeks, 3 weeks in, you could develop a character. Okay. Now that I got you to the point of understanding that they understood that role play, character development is important. This is where splat books come in and become additional things for 2nd edition AD&D. The core is the core 3 books. Splat books are all optional stuff. Most people aren't using the majority of it, so to criticize 2nd edition based on the splat books is to say that you were not really in the old school era and you really don't understand 2nd edition. That's what you tell me right away. If you say, yeah, 2nd edition based on the splat books, right away I'm like, well, you're ignorant and you're not really old school. Not really. Sorry to be so Amy with that, but I was there in the old school era. So I know how people on the mass ran the game, how they approached it. The splat books didn't make a difference. They were ignored. So the way I understand 2nd edition is the 3 core books. We would use things that wouldn't alter what they were. Kits was not an alteration in any real sense. We would borrow non-weapon proficiencies, equipment and whatnot, but if you got to gameplay and said, combat, and 99% of DMs just said, yeah, no thank you. Not interested. So if you say 2nd edition was bad because of that, again, it just tells me you're not really old school. I would call you a fake. So kits. Let's focus on kits. Kits are a concept. You pick a fighter. Okay, maybe the kit is going to be guard. There are some things you could focus on, like, okay, you need ability scores. No. What I would do personally, just telling you personally, is the ability score requirement for fighter was good enough. So you're picking a guard. The idea is you don't want to give too much and there's going to be balance. So on the side of benefits, you might look at a guard like, oh, they're good at negotiating. So you find some area where negotiating is important. You don't move up ability scores, but any area where they're negotiating with someone, you can give them a +1, right? If there's a dice roll needed for anything, any area like that, or what else you can look at is non-weapon proficiencies, which are skills, non-weapon proficiencies. There are skills in AD&D 2nd edition. You look and you might see 1 or 2 of them where you'll be like, okay, I can't give a big list of skills because not all guards are going to be everything, right? One guard might be good at certain things, another guard might be good at other things. You're going to pick a lane or whatever, or the DM is going to have a lane for your guard where, okay, they're going to be more good at these 2 things. You give a couple of additional skills, non-weapon proficiencies to the character. Then you look at where they would be weak. Well, where would you not train if you were a guard? What would you not be good at? What would you avoid? Where setbacks would be? So you want to balance out the benefits with possibly negatives, right? Like if you see negatives, it doesn't have to be overkill. It doesn't have to be equal negatives, but you got to make sure if there is areas where guards would avoid something and not get better at that thing or not even stay stable at the thing, okay, you put your minus in. Now, you want to look at role play. Okay, if you're a guard, you'd be into order, you'd be this, you'd be that. So you wouldn't role play that type of character in a certain way. They're not going to act like a drunk going into the bar who doesn't care about law. Right? So they're going to care about some things, and you're going to give some guidance right away through them being a guard. It could be a cavalier, for example. It could be a samurai. It could be an honor system. Either way, it's going to be a guidance of how you roleplay the character, because now the game understands, 2nd edition understands that who the character is doesn't start at you don't figure that out at the dungeon. You start right away trying to figure that out even while you're in the town. Behavior was mandatory for a kit, well, because that's why you're getting the kit in the first place. You don't get the bonuses at all without the control on role play, right? If you just want to play a farmer with no rules applied to you in that way, you just don't get any benefits. You don't get a kit. But if you want a kit, what you're doing is you're playing in to that role play aspect of character development that 2nd edition wants to push from the get-go out of the gate, unlike any edition before it. Now, if you go look, the Splat Books have, in 2nd edition have kits. They do. Blade Slinger might be one you want to avoid. Not all of them are perfect. The odd one can be broken, right? Just pay attention. Think about the effects on gameplay. And then think about the campaign that you want to run. Which kits fit in, or maybe you'll make one. Maybe you'll make a kit. Alignment can be important to the type of role play there's going to be. If that type of role play wouldn't be anywhere near evil, well then you're not going to allow a lawful evil character to be that thing, right? So alignment can be important. The race can be important. Some races have a certain attitude towards things, so you don't want to align a kit that wouldn't align with the race. So you want to check that stuff out. Make sure everything's kosher on that end. But races have certain kits. There are certain kits for a lot of different areas. Make sure it's going to fit your campaign, or if your campaign's a little bit more open, whatever's suitable to the player. Nothing's perfect, and a lot of kit ideas I think were put out there without real play testing. That's why you might see one or two that just sort of breaks in pieces. Use your common sense, your understanding of the game to really examine the kits and what it means to allow somebody to do this or have that, what that means compared to what they're up against. It's not hard to figure out a kit is broken even before you start gameplay. It really isn't, so you can avoid broken kits. Blade Slinger be a one, right? So just be careful when you're looking at the kits. Either way, kits are going to help with the role play and character development, which is really important. And what we found out with 2nd edition is, instead of having all these broken campaigns, you would develop a character in a few weeks, and players would consistently come back. You would finish off campaigns, and now you go from 1 or 2 in a large community of having games that last over a year, maybe 3 or 4 in some other communities, to having like 20 have games go over a year. And I mean, like having just mass numbers into the months of campaigns, like where it lasts for months. Other ones last for years. Consistent players showing up where you're 6 months in, you're like, these are the same players I started with, and they pretty much come just about every week to the table. Pretty consistent. But it really had to hit out of the park of character development and action. So a lot of 2nd edition DMs just sort of bent into the action early. Get just this reality, because this is the way players wanted to play the game. They bend into the action and then focus on character development. And those two aspects, which I could tell the nerds at TSR just didn't want to give into. They didn't want that to be the thing, but that's what it was. Where WotC, I think, has more success is they lean hard into it. Though what I think happened with WotC is they sort of doomed themselves even from 3rd edition on. Because the more complicated the game is, the less people want to run that game, but the more people that want to play it. And so you start having something happen where you have a surplus of players, but very few DMs. It's why 2nd edition kept up with 3rd edition in the open market for the first 8 years of WotC editions. 2nd edition kept up. It either would have more active games or equal, but at no point did 3rd edition have more active games going on than 2nd edition. And the reason 2nd edition was more active is it was more appealing to people that want to run the game. So that's really important. That's where you get your games. So you might have more people in the 3rd edition world at the time. There was more people to look at. There was more players to choose from with 3rd edition, but there were massively less DMs than there were when you compare it to the amount of people in the 2nd edition zone. It's just the way it was, right? Just not enough DMs to cover 3rd edition players. I don't know how many 3rd edition players simply had the books and went years with never playing a game, but they're out there trying to get into one, but there's just, the games are always full. And I'll give it to 3rd edition DMs, they can fill up their game no problem, but that's because there's a lack of DMs and a desperate group of players trying to get games. Where 2nd edition, our players were fucking absolutely spoiled with the amount of DMs we had. Absolutely spoiled, right? Absolutely spoiled. We could do things that 3rd edition couldn't do. We do the shared world, the one-to-one time thing, the old leaning into tournament play. But we could do that because our shared world would have a surplus of DMs. You couldn't do that with 3rd edition because there wasn't enough DMs to form a shared world in any solid way. I think it's because the more complicated the rules are, given the amount of work the DM is already doing, the less DMs want to actually touch that game. And that was true with 3rd edition. It was even more true with 4th edition. And you're seeing the problems now with 5e. A massive amount of players, very few DMs. They flake out, they go away, they don't last. The more complicated it is, the more people don't want to run the game. And when you make it too easy, here's the problem with 5e. When you make it too easy for the DM, it becomes a boring task. So most of the guys I know flaked out from 5e, I'll ask them, was it really hard? And they'll be like, and I tried it myself. No, in reality, it's not that hard. It's just really boring. So their involvement becomes less and less and less. The book is the king, not them. Their passion isn't there. So that's why they flake out. That's at least what I've been told numerous times. Maybe I'm wrong, but that's what I've been told. And from my own experience, that's the way it felt to me. I tried to run 5e, or I did run 5e, and I felt no passion in the experience for the game. It felt like I was a middleman between the book and the players. And so there was nothing in it for me. And I didn't care if the players had a good time. I mean, I can imagine a DM is going to be happy about that little ego boost for the first 2 or 3 sessions of what they're doing with the group. And it's like, yeah, okay, the ego boost is gone. I played that card already. Now what? Nothing follows that. So most DMs flake out for 5e. That's been a problem for all WotC editions from the time 3rd edition came out until now.